Nancy Guthrie's daughter speaks out with powerful speeches. Her words change the case forever. Let's start at the scene, because everything in this case begins and ends with what investigators found inside that house. When law enforcement arrived at Nancy's home on February 1st, 2026, the first thing a trained investigator does is read the scene before touching anything. You stand in the doorway, you look, you take in the whole picture before you start breaking it into pieces. And what they saw told them immediately this was not a missing person situation in the ordinary sense. This was a crime scene. The first and most critical piece of physical evidence was the blood, confirmed forensically to be Nancy's. Now, when a detective sees blood at a scene, the first question is not who, the first question is where. Because the location of blood tells you the story of what happened and in what order, and the location of Nancy's blood told investigators something enormously important. She made it inside. She was through the front door. She was home. The violence did not happen on the street or the driveway or the front porch. It happened inside the house, which means she felt safe, which means whatever hit her after she believed she was in the one place nothing could reach her. That detail alone changes the entire character of this crime. This was not a grab from a parking lot. This was not a carjacking gone wrong. This was a trap, set inside her own home, and she walked straight into it. Now a good detective at this point turns their attention to the entry points. Because if blood confirms something happened inside, the next question is, how did the people who did this get in? And this is where the crime scene stops being straightforward and starts being something that should genuinely unsettle you. Nancy had a security gate on her front door, not decorative, functional, engineered specifically to resist forced entry from the outside. This was a woman who lived alone and took that seriously. She had invested in real protection, and investigators examining that gate concluded it was almost certainly not breached from the outside. The integrity of that gate pointed toward one deeply uncomfortable conclusion. Whoever was inside that house when Nancy arrived did not come through the front. They were already in. Before she got home, before her family dropped her off, before 9:45 p.m. Meaning, while Nancy sat at dinner with her children, while she laughed and talked and had no reason to look over her shoulder, at least one person was already positioned inside her house in the dark, waiting for her to come home. Now, a detective hearing that conclusion immediately starts asking a different set of questions. Not how did they get through the gate, but how did they get past it in the first place? That means either there was a secondary entry point, a window, a back door, a less secured access point they had identified and exploited ahead of time, or someone with knowledge of that home, its layout, its access points, its routines, gave them what they needed to get inside. That second possibility is the one that would keep a good detective awake at night, because it implies this crime had roots. Yet somebody somewhere at some point either gave up information about Nancy's home deliberately or without knowing what they were handing over. And that chain of information is one of the most critical threads in this entire investigation. Let's move to the doorbell camera, because this is the piece of forensic evidence that in any well-functioning investigation would be treated as gold. Investigators pulled the footage, and what they found was a masked individual, armed, standing directly at Nancy's front door, not trying to get inside, not panicking, not rushing, doing one specific thing with complete deliberate calm, tampering with that camera. Think about what a detective sees when they watch that footage. They see someone who knew the camera was there. They see someone who came prepared to deal with it. As they see someone whose first priority upon arriving at that door was not entry, it was elimination of evidence. That is a person who has thought about being caught. That is a person who has run this scenario in their head enough times to know that the camera is a liability and to plan accordingly. That level of premeditation is what separates a crime of passion from an operation, and this was an operation. Now, the detective's job with that footage is identification. You pull every frame, you study clothing, body shape, height estimated against the door frame, the way the person moves, their gait, the angle of their shoulders, how they hold their arm when they reach toward the camera. You look for anything that pierces through the mask and the deliberate concealment to something real underneath. Investigators had that footage. If federal analysts had that footage, and publicly weeks and then months later, not a single identification has been announced, which tells you either the footage was too degraded from the tampering to yield clean analysis, or it yielded something that investigators are holding extremely close for reasons they have not disclosed. Either way, the camera that was supposed to protect Nancy became the first piece of evidence the people who took her tried to destroy. Now, let's talk about what came after, because the crime scene does not end at the physical house. It extends outward into the days that followed in the form of the ransom notes. Multiple notes, not one, multiple. And here is how a detective reads a ransom note. You read it on 3 levels simultaneously. First, you read the demand. What are they asking for, and what does that tell you about what they know about this family? The demand was for millions of dollars in cryptocurrency. Millions. That number is not random. That number reflects research. Somebody profiled this family's financial capacity and decided a 7-figure demand was achievable. And the cryptocurrency specification tells you something equally important. This person understands digital finance well enough to know that cryptocurrency transactions are significantly harder to trace than wire transfers. They were not just making a demand. They were constructing an exit route designed to frustrate investigators. That is not street-level criminal thinking. That is calculated, deliberate planning built around a kidnapping. Second, a detective reads the deadlines. 2 were set, both around February 9th. Both passed. And here is what a detective knows about deadlines that pass without consequence. It means one of 3 things. Negotiation is happening privately, and the deadline was never meant to be absolute. The kidnapper's circumstances have changed, and they are recalibrating. Or the deadline was psychological pressure from the beginning, designed to manufacture panic and force the family into emotional decisions rather than rational ones. Every single one of those readings points to the same profile. A person or group managing the psychology of this situation as deliberately as they managed the physical crime scene. This was not desperation. This was control. Now, let's talk about the Uber, because this detail gets buried in coverage, and it should not. Investigators traced a ride Nancy took on the evening of January 31st, hours before she disappeared. They found the driver. The FBI collected all footage from that vehicle and reviewed every second of it. And what they found was Nancy appearing completely normal. No fear, no distraction, no sign anything was wrong. A detective looking at that footage takes something very specific from it. Nancy did not know she was being watched. Whatever surveillance had been done on her, whatever intelligence had been gathered on her routines and her home and her schedule, had been done invisibly enough that she never once felt it. That is not amateur behavior. People who surveil poorly leave traces. They linger too long. They ask one too many questions of the wrong neighbor. They do something that trips a wire in the target's instincts. Nancy's Uber footage shows a woman with no tripped wires, which means whoever planned this was disciplined enough to watch her without ever letting her feel watched. Think about how long that kind of invisible surveillance takes. Think about the patience and the deliberateness it requires. And then think about the fact that all of that patience, all of that planning, all of that calculated invisible preparation was aimed at one 83-year-old woman living alone in a quiet neighborhood in the Arizona desert. Now, let's shift, because everything so far is the crime itself. But now, we need to talk about the response. Because in a case like this, the investigation is not just a backdrop. The investigation is part of the story. And in the case of Nancy Guthrie, the investigation is where this case becomes something beyond a crime. It becomes a systemic failure, unfolding in real time while she is still missing. The early response looked appropriate on the surface. The Pima County Sheriff's Department took lead. The FBI moved in. U.S. Customs and Border Protection got involved, suggesting investigators were seriously considering the possibility Nancy had been moved across a border. Search and rescue teams covered terrain, multiple agencies, multiple resources, the full weight of law enforcement pressing down on this case from the outside. But underneath that surface, something was already wrong, and it was wrong at the very top. Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, the man standing at the podium, the face of the investigation to the public and to the Guthrie family. It emerged during the active investigation, while Nancy was still missing, while the family was still waiting, that there were serious discrepancies in Sheriff Nanos's professional background. In his resume, the details of his official record did not match what he had presented, and the response from the oversight body responsible for holding him accountable was not a quiet internal review. The Pima County Board of Supervisors voted to require the sheriff to submit reports under oath. Under oath. That is a formal legal escalation. That is elected officials saying, "We do not trust what you are telling us," without legal consequence attached to every word. And it happened while Nancy Guthrie was still missing, while her family was watching press conferences and waiting for news that never came. But it did not stop there, because then the people who work for Nanos every single day made their own move. Yes, the deputies of the Pima County Sheriff's Department held a vote, and the result was unanimous. Every single vote was a no-confidence vote in their own sheriff. Not a majority, not a close decision, unanimous. They called publicly for his resignation. Now think about what that does to an active kidnapping investigation. The FBI is insulated because federal investigators do not answer to the county sheriff. But the sheriff's department is still part of this investigation. They are still the local law enforcement foundation underneath the federal response. And when that foundation is cracking, when the leader of that department is defending himself against credibility challenges and oversight requirements, and his own deputies declaring publicly they have no faith in him, what happens to the people working the case beneath him? Or what happens to morale? What happens to communication between local and federal investigators? What happens to the local threads that only county-level investigators are positioned to pull? What happens to the family's trust in the institution that is supposed to be their partner in finding their mother? It fractures, not all at once, not in a single visible moment, but gradually and quietly in the way trust always fractures under sustained pressure from the inside. And at the center of all of it, completely removed from every internal political battle, was a family. Savannah, Annie, Cameron, waiting. Every single day waiting for a phone call that kept not coming. On February 24th, the family did something that told you everything about where things stood. Yet they offered a $1 million reward for information leading to Nancy's safe recovery. $1 million. That number is not routine. Families do not produce million-dollar rewards when they feel confident investigators are close to an answer. A $1 million reward is what you do when weeks have gone by, the case is not broken, the institutional picture is complicated, and you have decided to go directly to the public because you are running out of options inside the system. At $1 million, you are betting that somewhere out there is a person sitting on information who just needs the math to change enough to make them talk. And even that was not enough. The deadlines passed. The reward was offered. The FBI worked its threads. The sheriff's department fought itself around its compromised leadership. And Nancy Guthrie was still not found. 57 days in the family was still on camera, still pleading. Don't let this go quiet, because they understood what quiet means in a case like this. Quiet means the news cycle moves on. Quiet means tips stop coming. Quiet means the window that is already closing gets a little smaller every single day. And the people who planned this crime so carefully, who watched and waited and prepared for every detail, did not need the investigation to fall apart. But it fell apart anyway, right around them. And that failure is just as much a part of this story as the blood on the floor and the masked figure on the camera and the cryptocurrency ransom with its 2 cold past deadlines. Here is where we are. Nancy was taken from inside her own home on the night of January 31st, 2026. Her blood confirms violence happened inside after she felt safe. The security gate confirms someone was likely already inside before she arrived. The doorbell footage confirms this was planned and deliberate. The ransom notes confirm a sophisticated, financially researched operation. The Uber footage confirms Nancy never saw it coming. The investigation that followed had the resources. It had the federal support. It had everything it needed on paper. And then it had a sheriff whose credibility was being challenged under oath while the case was open. Deputies unanimously declaring no confidence while the family waited. A $1 million reward that couldn't break the silence. No named suspect. No public identification of the figure on that camera. Is no answer to the most fundamental question of the crime scene, which is, how did they get inside that house before she came home? That question remains unanswered. And until it is answered, everything else sits on top of it unresolved. Because the answer to that question points directly at who did this. It connects the planning to a person. It connects the research to a relationship or a surveillance operation or an inside access point. It is the thread that when pulled will start unraveling everything else. And right now, that thread is still untouched. Or, if it has been touched, investigators are not saying what they found on the other end of it. Nancy Guthrie is 83 years old. She walked through her front door on the night of January 31st, 2026, and has not been seen since. If somewhere out there right now is at least one person who knows exactly what happened inside that house, who was already in there when she came home, who stood at that front door masked and armed with a plan they had spent real time building, who wrote those ransom notes, who chose cryptocurrency specifically because it is harder to follow, who set those deadlines knowing they could let them pass. That person knows. And there may be others around them who know pieces without knowing the whole picture. A detail that didn't sit right, a conversation overheard, a vehicle that had no business being on that street, someone who asked one too many questions about a quiet neighborhood in the Catalina foothills. If you are sitting on something small and telling yourself it doesn't matter, understand this. In a case this carefully planned, it is almost never a massive confession that breaks it open. It is one small thread pulled by one person who almost stayed quiet. Here it is. If this story hit you the way it hit me when I first went deep into it, then you already know this channel is different. We don't rush cases. We don't skip the details that matter. We sit with the stories that the news moves on from too fast, and we make sure they don't disappear. If that is something you want more of, hit that subscribe button right now because we have more cases coming that will stop you cold just like this one did. And if you watch this all the way to the end, thank you. Genuinely. It means you care about the truth and about the people behind these headlines, and that is exactly who this channel is built for. Share this video. I'll put it in front of as many eyes as possible, because awareness is the one thing that keeps a case like this alive. We will be updating this story as it develops, so turn on notifications so you don't miss it. Until next time, stay aware, stay sharp, and never forget the people still waiting to be found.